This is the fourth session of the new teacher training. With feedback that we received, we're focusing today on artifact collection. The learning target for today: I will understand which artifacts to collect and/or develop as evidence for demonstrating proficiency in the Massachusetts Educator Evaluation System rubric. To achieve the learning target, there are 3 success criteria. Firstly, review the rubric for the targeted element, highlighting important language. Secondly, identify district, state, and other resources that provide ideas on artifacts for that element. And lastly, cross-reference the element rubric requirements with the list of recommended artifacts to choose the artifact that best aligns. So to begin with, we will need to have access to the rubric language. Here are the 3 different rubrics that the state has provided for the different roles within the school. These are live links, so you can click on any of these and it will bring you to that resource. You'll need to ask yourself the question, which standards should I focus on? And while you can collect artifacts for all the standards, 1 through 4, generally observations by administrators cover standards 1 and 2, and generally artifacts that you submit are for standards 3 and 4. So here's an example of an element that you may want to choose to focus on. This is for standard 3, indicator C, and element 1, which is two-way communication. When you're looking at an element, when you're doing this analysis, you'll want to focus on the proficient language. This is what's necessary for you to be proficient. So looking at this example more in-depthly, this is the language of the element. It says regularly uses two-way communication with families about student performance and learning and responds promptly and carefully to communications from families. So that's the language. Now we need to understand what is the important language here. So here's the language about this particular element, two-way communication. And what you'll want to do is, while reading through it, you'll want to really understand what are the call to action, what is the particular language that is going to prove necessary for you to collect information on. Here, the highlighted language is probably the drivers for that language. So regularly, it's talking about frequency, two-way communication versus just one-way communication. With families is obviously the subject. It's not with colleagues or administrators or anyone else. What is the topic? Student performance and learning. And then there's a qualifier. How are you responding then to family communication? Promptly and carefully. And this is just a continuation of that. This really is the language that when you start crafting a tool to collect this information, you'll need to ensure that the artifact touches upon all of these elements of the rubric language. So here is the artifact resource page. These are all live links to ideas for you to choose from. Here's an example for nurses. We can click on this link. If we scroll through, and this is a particularly useful one for nurses. Here's an element 1A1, and it says how might this look and potential sources of evidence. So this is a very useful resource for nurses that you can wade through these waters, through this language, and say this would be to satisfy 1A1. Maybe there are some ideas embedded in this document. Similarly, there is an MTA artifact document that you can look at that also provides some ideas. The district resource from a previous professional development, a lot of the new teachers came together and shared ideas on what may be good ideas to satisfy certain elements. So use these links as necessary. So once you've identified the language for a particular element and you have an idea of how to collect that information using those district resources or state resources, you'll need to then submit your information in the artifact collection tool. Now, some schools may be not using this as it's been a decision made by the building administrator, but in this case, we want to have you use this tool to submit your information. So this is a live link that goes right to the intranet, and when you click on that, you will see it'll it'll bring you straight to the page. But if you don't use a link and you're on the internet, the way in which you can find that information is by going to the evaluation system, and step 3 says evidence collection. You can select that. It will open up a folder with all the educators' names here and a link to the resource. Now, they're all the same, and you're going to then individualize it by putting your own information. And if you could try, but the way the sharing has been set up, you won't be able to access anyone else's account. So I can click on this because I have universal permissions, but when you open it up, it'll look very similarly. And if you need any help or clarification on how to use this tool, there is a YouTube video in this upper left-hand corner that you can watch. But the basics are, is you want to, after you have developed this artifact collection or this evidence, you'll want to share it appropriately in Google Drive and then paste the URL here. Similarly, you'll want to explain your rationale, and the rationale is the explicit connections between your artifact and the rubric language. So for instance, let's say you're submitting an artifact for 1A1. Here you would just put an X and it highlights it in green, and then it says, hey, 1A1 has been satisfied. And you could do that. You can hover over this and you see the proficient language, which is kind of a convenience. But this is what you'll want to be using when you submit an example artifact for the new teacher training. This is all in service of this assignment, and the assignment is to identify a specific element or elements on the educator evaluation tool, examine the language description, and choose or develop your artifact. Once you've done that, you'll want to submit the sample artifact into the collection tool like we just described, and then complete the rationale in the artifact collection tool. This concludes session 4 of the new teacher training.